I never thought I'd end up living in a house that smells like old vanilla candles and regret. But here I am, perched on my faded green armchair, the one that sags in all the wrong places, sipping lukewarm coffee and pretending I'm reading a book when really, I'm listening to the creaks of the floorboards, counting the number of times my cat, Mr. Whiskers, has judged me today. It's a Sunday, or maybe a Tuesday. It doesn't matter. Time has been optional ever since Harold left. Or maybe it was me who left him. Who can say anymore? Love, I have discovered, is a little like baking a souffle. You follow the instructions, you pray, and then poof, it collapses. Sometimes in the oven, sometimes in your life, sometimes right in the middle of a grocery store aisle, when the person you married for 32 years decides to tell you he always wanted to be a jazz musician instead of a dentist. And don't even get me started on the affair. I found out about it, not in some dramatic scene with accusations and shattered glass, but quietly, like a note slipped under the bathroom door. I unfolded it with trembling hands and read the words that would haunt me longer than any ghost ever could. I'm sorry. I never stopped thinking about her. Her. The mysterious her who had apparently been living rent-free in Harold's brain while I was busy making meatloaf and polishing silver. I suppose I should have been angry. I should have thrown the note into the fireplace and demanded explanations that would never come. But instead, I laughed. A short, bitter laugh that startled Mr. Whiskers, who responded with his patented look of disdain. Because isn't life cruel in the funniest way? Isn't it ironic that the person you trusted most, the one you swore you'd grow old with, ends up being a character in your own personal dark comedy? I poured another cup of coffee and decided that if Harold wanted a jazz life, he could have it, preferably somewhere far away and without my good china. There's a peculiar freedom that comes with betrayal. I noticed it first while walking down Main Street, watching the Sunday parade of people who had their lives neatly aligned and wondering if they knew how fragile all of it was. I had always considered myself cautious, a believer in routine and polite smiles, but now I felt untethered. I could go anywhere, do anything. And yet, a part of me lingered in the house, in the sticky corners of memory, and in the quiet hum of appliances that knew me longer than anyone else. It's funny how homes become museums for our regrets, each object a plaque commemorating an old disappointment or a long-forgotten romance. The mailman dropped a stack of letters on the porch, one of them a postcard from somewhere tropical, sent by a woman named Clarissa. I had never met Clarissa, but she knew Harold intimately enough to comment on his tan lines. I carried the postcard inside, examined the writing, traced the loops of her letters with my finger. The audacity of people in love, or in lust, or whatever category you put people who are clearly enjoying themselves at your expense. I put the postcard on the fridge, with a magnet shaped like a cat, right above a note that said, "Don't forget, life is short. Your wine should be long." By noon, I found myself in the kitchen, chopping onions and thinking about Harold. Not with anger, not with sadness, but with curiosity. Where had the line been crossed? Was it the lull of everyday monotony or some long dormant dissatisfaction finally taking its bow? I imagined him there, telling Clarissa a joke I once used to tell, laughing at something I had perfected in my own living room. The scene was absurd, almost cinematic, and I laughed again. Only this time it was softer, more genuine, tinged with the strange relief that comes from seeing your life as a story, rather than a prison sentence. Evenings are the hardest. The house quiets down, shadows lengthen, and I catch myself talking to the furniture as though it were a congregation. "You remember when we almost bought that puppy, and he peed on the carpet?" I whisper to the sofa. Sometimes I imagine Harold listening from somewhere far away,
a character in my narrative rather than a co-author of it. There's a lightness in thinking of people as characters. They're easier to forgive, easier to pity, and somehow less likely to ruin your day. By nightfall, I'm curled up on the couch with Mr. Whiskers draped over my chest, a blanket tangled around my knees, and a glass of wine that has probably been in the same bottle for a week. I think about love and betrayal and the absurdity of human expectations. I think about how I survived it all, how the cracks in my heart have formed a mosaic that glows if you look close enough. And I realize something vital. Life isn't about avoiding the messes, the betrayals, the comic tragedies. Life is about dancing through them with a smirk, a shrug, and occasionally a cat on your chest. Because tomorrow, Harold might call, or Clarissa might write another postcard, or the world might just keep spinning indifferent to my feelings, and I will be here, sipping coffee that's slightly too cold, laughing at the irony of it all, and wondering what ridiculous, beautiful, heartbreaking thing comes next.
It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. Days had started to blend together ever since Harold's departure, like a poorly edited montage in some sad indie film. I woke up to Mr. Whiskers sitting on my chest, tail twitching with the precision of a metronome. I swear, cats have a sixth sense for emotional distress. They pick the exact moment you need to be reminded that the world doesn't revolve around heartbreak. It revolves around breakfast, naps, and knocking things off tables. I pushed him off gently, muttering something about how one day I'd write a tell-all memoir about my life and he'd have to be the villain. And he responded with a slow blank, which in cat language is the equivalent of, "Good luck, human, you'll need it." Coffee was essential. Not just any coffee, but the kind of coffee that tastes like a liquid apology for all the mistakes you've made and will make. I made it strong, black, and slightly bitter, like my outlook on men these days. I considered calling Harold, but the thought of actually hearing his voice felt like opening a time capsule filled with expired expectations. Instead, I opted for something safer, talking to my reflection. There is a peculiar intimacy in arguing with yourself in the bathroom mirror. I scolded my hair for rebelling and lectured my face for wrinkles, and in return, it just stared back at me, silent and accusatory. We were at an impasse, as we often are these days. After breakfast, which consisted of 2 hard-boiled eggs and a slice of bread that I swear had been in the pantry since the Reagan administration, I decided it was time to face the world. I pulled on my most defiant cardigan, the one with tiny embroidered daisies that I like to imagine makes me look approachable yet untouchable, and I ventured out into the sunlight that had no intention of caring about my personal woes. Main Street was bustling, as always. The bakery smelled like sugar and nostalgia. The florist was arranging roses with the kind of precision that suggested either training or obsession. And the post office clerk gave me that familiar look, the one that says, "We all know you're a disaster, but good luck anyway." I stopped by the cafe on the corner. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your favorite drink, and probably the name of the person you're secretly in love with. Or, in my case, the person who made my life a cautionary tale. I ordered a latte, extra foam, and sat near the window. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had happened, as if Harold's jazz dreams and Clarissa's audacious postcards were insignificant in the grand scheme of existence. I sipped my coffee, allowing the bitterness to settle in my mouth, reminding me that life had layers, some sweet, some bitter, some inexplicably nutty. The cafe was warm, a contrast to the chill in my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. I watched couples pass by, hand in hand, their laughter as a soundtrack that made my chest tighten just a little bit. But it wasn't pain, exactly. It was curiosity. I wondered about the stories behind those hands, the secrets they held, the small betrayals they had survived or were about to. Maybe that's what drew me to the world again, the idea that life didn't end with Harold's departure, that there were still narratives to be uncovered,
even if I had to dig through the rubble of my own heart to find them. As I was contemplating these existential matters, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Margaret Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of gossip and unsolicited life advice. Margaret has a knack for showing up exactly when you're trying to avoid human interaction, her presence both comforting and mildly terrifying. She spotted me immediately, waved like we're in some kind of sitcom, and plopped down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Well, well, well," she said, inspecting me like a vet examining a particularly stubborn cat. "How's the heart holding up, darling?" I smiled, a little too tight, a little too practiced. "Surviving," I said, and that was technically true. My heart was surviving, even if my trust in humanity had taken an extended vacation. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice as if the cafe were a war zone and secrets were landmines. She said, "I saw the postcard," she said, nodding towards my hand that held the latte cup. "From Clarissa. Darling, you have to tell me, what's the story there?" I paused, considering whether to lie, to dramatize, or to simply tell the truth with the kind of dry humor that has become my armor. "Oh, you know," I said, waving a hand vaguely. "Harold always wanted a tropical pen pal. It's part of his midlife jazz awakening." Margaret snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Midlife jazz awakening? Honey, the man is 39, not 3,900. And postcards don't just appear out of thin air unless someone's up to no good. Spill it." I laughed, a sound that was part amusement, part exasperation. "Fine. He had an affair. She's the other woman. She's, how should I put it, the reason my meatloaf has been more meaningful than my marriage lately." Margaret gasped, which would have been hilarious if it weren't genuine. "Oh dear. Oh dear, dear, dear. And here I thought you two were the poster couple for boring suburban bliss. What are you going to do?" "Survive, probably. Write memoirs, drink coffee, stare out windows, maybe adopt a dog. Or a parrot. Something that won't cheat on me." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Oh, my sweet, ironic friend. Life's too short to be a victim of other people's poor taste. You'll see, this is just the beginning of a very entertaining chapter." And she was right, of course. Life had a way of turning betrayal into theater, and I was suddenly cast in the protagonist in a story that was both tragic and ridiculously funny. Later that afternoon, I wandered into the local bookstore. It's small and cramped, filled with dusty shelves and the faint smell of old paper, the kind of place that feels like a secret you've been keeping from yourself. I found myself in the romance section, ironically enough, flipping through novels that promised happily ever afters that felt both alien and comforting. One of the books caught my eye, a memoir by a woman who had survived heartbreak, divorce, and a series of unfortunate decisions, all while maintaining a sense of humor sharp enough to slice through the thickest wall of self-pity. I opened it randomly and read, "There is no shame in laughing at the absurdity of life. It's the only armor that fits without being too tight." I laughed aloud, startling the clerk who gave me a polite, cautious smile. I closed the book and tucked it under my arm, a talisman against despair. The day was slowly unfolding into something unpredictable, something that didn't require me to wallow, but rather to observe, to participate, and occasionally to manipulate events with the subtlety of someone who has seen too much to be easily fooled. By evening, I returned home, my mind buzzing with ideas, observations, and plans. I made dinner for one because cooking for anyone else felt like a concession I wasn't ready to make. The onions sizzled in the pan, releasing their pungent aroma, and I found myself narrating the scene in my head as if I were on stage. Here she is, alone but unbroken, chopping onions like she's slicing through the nonsense of her past. Mr. Whiskers observed silently, his tail swishing with approval or judgment. I could never tell which. Dinner was simple, but I savored it with the kind of attention usually reserved for wine tastings and art exhibitions. I thought about Harold again, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. Where had he gone? What kind of jazz had he found? Was Clarissa really as perfect as the postcard suggested, or was she just another flawed human navigating her own absurd narrative? I considered writing her a letter, but the idea quickly dissolved into laughter. No, Clarissa didn't need my commentary. She had Harold, I had my life, and that was enough for now. Night fell, and with it came a strange calm. I lit a candle, the scent of vanilla mingling with the faint aroma of last night's dinner, and I curled up on the couch with a book and Mr. Whiskers. The shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost conspiratorial, like they were sharing a joke that only I could understand. I thought about love, betrayal, and the peculiar way life has of rearranging itself without asking for permission. Sleep was elusive, as always, but I didn't mind. Lying awake, I reflected on the day's revelations, the encounters, the small victories, and the absurdity of human behavior. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Life's too short to be a victim of other people's poor taste. I repeated them silently, letting the phrase settle in my chest, and I realized she was right. I didn't need closure from Harold or understanding from Clarissa or validation from anyone. I needed perspective, humor, and the courage to keep moving forward, even if it meant tripping over my own feet along the way. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I imagined tomorrow, full of mundane tasks, unexpected encounters, and tiny triumphs. I imagined a world where I could walk down Main Street without flinching, order coffee without judgment, and maybe even find joy in the ordinary chaos that surrounded me. I imagined Mr. Whiskers perched on my chest, judging and comforting in equal measure, and me laughing quietly, not at the world, but with it, understanding at last that the best way to survive a broken heart is to treat it like a plot twist in a story you're still writing. Because life, in all its messy, ironic splendor, doesn't wait for anyone, and neither do I.
Morning arrived with a quiet persistence, the kind that refuses to be ignored, even by someone who has spent years perfecting the art of postponement. I opened my eyes to sunlight spilling across the bedroom floor in uneven stripes, and Mr. Whiskers was already on patrol, stalking imaginary prey like a tiny, furry private investigator. I lay there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the city waking up, and realized that, for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a person in suspended animation. Instead, I felt like someone who had been invited back into life, whether I wanted it or not. Coffee was mandatory. I brewed a pot strong enough to wake the dead, or at least my own frazzled nerves. The aroma wrapped around me like a familiar, slightly sarcastic friend, and I sipped slowly, savoring the warmth that seeped into my chest. There's a peculiar satisfaction in the routine of morning, a sense of control over small things when everything else feels like a tornado of unpredictability. I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window, hair sticking out at odd angles, eyes rimmed with the faintest hint of last night's insomnia, and thought, well, if this is the version of me the world gets today, let's make it entertaining. I decided to venture beyond my usual haunts. Main Street was fine for window shopping and people watching, but the day demanded something riskier. I pulled on my most audacious jacket, the one with sequins that caught the light like a hint of rebellion, and set out. The streets were alive, the city breathing in rhythms that were both familiar and exhilarating. I passed the bookstore, the bakery, the florist, and noticed how my presence there had changed. People who used to smile politely now seemed to regard me with an amused curiosity, as if they could sense I was no longer the quiet, predictable woman they once cataloged in their mental files. I found myself drawn to the park, where the ducks waddled with a casual disregard for human drama, and the benches bore witness to countless whispered secrets. I settled on a familiar one, the kind that had a view of the fountain and a perfect angle for discreet observation of passers-by. Mr. Whiskers, who had somehow convinced himself to come along, sat on my lap, purring in what I decided was a tone of judgmental approval. I watched families, lovers, and solitary wanderers interact, noting the small tragedies, the absurdities, the tiny victories that made life so deliciously ironic.
Then I saw him. Not Harold. He was still safely ensconced in his tropical jazz dreams. But a man who seemed to exist purely for the narrative's sake, with a mop of unruly hair, a crooked smile, and eyes that suggested he had a private joke with the universe. He was trying to untangle a kite from a tree branch, cursing softly under his breath, completely oblivious to the world around him. I laughed quietly, and Mr. Whiskers twitched his ears in acknowledgement. There's something magnetic about people who appear unaware of their own charm, who fumble and stumble through life, yet somehow remain endearing. The man noticed me laughing, and his gaze met mine briefly before darting away, embarrassed. I considered whether I should approach, but decided against it. Observation has a certain power. One can learn more from watching than from intruding, and besides, I wasn't exactly ready to introduce chaos into my life just yet. Still, the encounter left a lingering warmth, a reminder that human connection could still surprise you, even when you were convinced it had abandoned you. After the park, I wandered into a small antiques shop, the kind with creaky floors and the faint smell of lavender and old wood. There's a particular thrill in antiquities, a sense of touching history and imagining the countless stories embedded in each object. I ran my fingers along porcelain figurines, inspected tarnished silverware, and picked up a delicate music box. I wound it carefully, and a soft, melancholy tune filled the room. It reminded me of Harold in a way that was neither painful nor sentimental, but oddly comforting, as if music could contain all the things words couldn't. The shopkeeper, a sprightly woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of everything she sold, watched me with interest. She said, "You have an eye for stories," as though reading my thoughts. "Every item here has a secret. Sometimes they choose the right person to tell it to." I smiled, a little amused, a little touched. I replied, "I've learned that people often choose the wrong person, but I suppose that's what makes life interesting." She nodded, as though she understood the irony perfectly. Indeed, and sometimes the wrong person becomes the story's plot twist, which is far more entertaining than a straight path. Her words lingered in my mind as I left the shop, cradling the music box as though it were a fragile fragment of my own life. The city hummed around me, oblivious to the small dramas unfolding in every corner, and I felt a curious mix of liberation and anticipation. Life wasn't about waiting for something monumental to happen. It was about noticing the twists, the unexpected humor, and the moments that made you pause and think, "This is absurdly beautiful." By late afternoon, I returned home, carrying a bag of groceries that felt heavier than usual, both physically and metaphorically. I unpacked the items with deliberate care, talking to Mr. Whiskers as if he were my audience. I said, "See, this is what survival looks like," holding up a head of lettuce, planning, perseverance, and just enough sarcasm to make it tolerable. Dinner was uneventful, but satisfying. I chopped vegetables, sautéed them with garlic, and sprinkled herbs with the precision of someone who found control in small acts. As I cooked, I reflected on the day's encounters, the man at the park, the antiques shop, Margaret's unsolicited wisdom, and realized that life had begun to reshape itself around me. I was no longer reacting purely out of grief or anger. I was participating, observing, and occasionally nudging events in directions that amused me. There's a subtle power in reclaiming your narrative, in treating your life as a story you write with a mix of humor, irony, and deliberate mischief. Evening arrived with the usual quiet, the kind that allows thoughts to ripple unimpeded. I sat on the couch, Mr. Whiskers curled against my side, and wound the music box. Its melody filled the room, delicate and bittersweet, reminding me that beauty often comes from unexpected places. I thought about Harold, Clarissa, and all the small betrayals and missteps that had led me here. And I realized something vital. Life's absurdity isn't a reason for despair. It's an invitation to engage, to laugh, to find meaning in chaos rather than waiting for it to arrive neatly packaged. Sleep came eventually, accompanied by dreams that were as strange as they were vivid. I saw Harold attempting to play a saxophone underwater, Clarissa floating above him on a cloud of postcards, and myself sitting on the sidelines, laughing and taking notes. The scenes were ridiculous, the narrative illogical, and yet somehow profoundly true. Dreams have a way of revealing what we refuse to acknowledge in daylight, the absurdity of expectations, the comedy in heartbreak, and the delicate balance between despair and delight. I woke with the sun pouring in through the curtains, Mr. Whiskers perched like a sentinel on the windowsill. The day awaited, full of potential, full of unpredictability, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready, not to conquer, not to avenge, not to understand fully, but to participate. Life had handed me a script with missing pages, characters with shifting motives, and plot twists that defied reason. And I, for once, was eager to improvise. Because that is the lesson I had learned, and it's worth sharing with anyone who dares to listen. Life is a dark comedy, full of irony, heartbreak, and ridiculous beauty. The only way to survive and to thrive is to engage with it fully, to laugh at the absurdity, and to remember that even when the world seems to have abandoned you, there are still stories waiting to unfold, characters waiting to surprise you, and moments waiting to make you feel alive again.
The phone rang at an ungodly hour, or at least it felt ungodly, because by then I had fully embraced the habit of sleeping in, a luxury I hadn't permitted myself in decades. Mr. Whiskers twitched his ears in irritation, as if the universe had personally disrupted his nap schedule, and I fumbled for the device on the nightstand, wondering which cosmic joke had chosen to invade my morning peace. It was Margaret, of course, probably having just finished her third cup of something that tastes like liquid alarm clocks. "Darling," she said, without preamble, "you are in trouble. And not the fun, flirtatious kind of trouble. Actual trouble. You need to come out." I sat up, blinking at the ceiling. "Margaret," I said, cautiously, "what did you do this time?" "Nothing I couldn't fix, but you need to see this for yourself. Life is throwing you a plot twist, and it's far too delicious to miss." There was that tone again, that unmistakable blend of excitement and mischief that makes you simultaneously wary and curious. I sighed, accepted that I had no choice but to comply, and threw on my jacket. Mr. Whiskers gave me a look that implied judgment and betrayal in equal measure, and I muttered, "You'll survive," as I carried him reluctantly out the door. The town square was alive with Saturday chaos. Farmers selling honey that smelled suspiciously like lavender, children running in circles with abandon, and street performers attempting to juggle without committing crimes against physics. But in the middle of it all, on the fountain's edge, stood Harold, or rather a version of him I didn't recognize immediately. He was attempting to teach a small, reluctant dog to dance in time to a busker's clarinet, flailing in ways that suggested either brilliance or catastrophic failure. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen, which was a relief. I wasn't ready to confront the living embodiment of postcard smugness just yet. Margaret nudged me, eyes sparkling. "Observe, my dear. This is your former husband in what I like to call his natural habitat, ridiculousness." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean he's auditioning for a circus?" "No, it's even better. He's auditioning for life, and he's failing spectacularly." I couldn't help but laugh. There was something undeniably absurd about watching a grown man wrestle with a dog in public while the rest of the world carried on, oblivious. I felt this strange mixture of pity and amusement, a cocktail I was rapidly becoming adept at drinking in public. Life had a way of rendering our worst mistakes into theater, and today's performance was particularly juicy. After a few minutes of moral support from a discreet distance, I turned away, feeling the familiar tug of curiosity mixed with apprehension. This was my life, my town, my chaos. And yet, I was suddenly aware of how much had changed. I had been observing Harold as a husband, a partner, a flawed human. Now, watching him perform absurdity without me, I realized how little control we actually have over the narratives of those we once loved. They spin off, collide with strangers, stumble through mistakes, and sometimes
for reasons entirely inexplicable, amuse us in ways we could never have predicted. I wandered down a side street I had never explored before, where the shops seemed untouched by time, and a faint breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee and old paper. There was a small cafe tucked into a corner, the kind that promises intimacy and discreet conversation. I ordered a cappuccino and sat at a table near the window, the city moving around me like a living storyboard. Margaret's earlier words rang in my mind. Life is throwing you a plot twist. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but I trusted her instincts, which were usually right about absurd human theater. The door chimed, and in walked Daniel, the man from the gallery. My heart skipped, though I didn't let it show. Daniel has a way of appearing at the precise moment the story needs him, like some uncredited supporting character who suddenly becomes indispensable. He smiled, and I smiled back, both of us acknowledging that the universe had a taste for coincidences that bordered on deliberate mischief. "Fancy seeing you here," I said, attempting casual nonchalance while secretly thrilled. He laughed, a sound that made ordinary streets feel cinematic. "The same could be said for you. I take this as a plot twist of your own making." "Perhaps. Or maybe life just enjoys irony." We talked about everything and nothing, about art, absurdity, and the peculiar resilience of cats. Daniel's presence was a reminder that connection doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it tiptoes in, carrying subtle warmth and the ability to make even minor tragedies feel like part of a story worth telling. I noticed how easy it was to laugh with him, how effortless it felt to slip into a conversation that was both meaningful and delightfully frivolous. By late afternoon, the square had emptied, leaving behind an almost cinematic emptiness. I wandered aimlessly, feeling the thrill of autonomy, the strange, satisfying pleasure of choosing your own path, even when it leads you through chaos. I passed an old theater, long since converted into a museum, and paused to admire the faded marquee. It read in chipped gold letters, "Life, a dark comedy in 3 acts." I laughed quietly. Somehow it seemed that my life was following the script of a play I hadn't auditioned for, and yet I was increasingly eager to participate. Homeward bound, I stopped by the bookstore to pick up a volume I had been eyeing for weeks, a collection of essays on human absurdity and resilience. The shopkeeper, a man whose patience seemed as infinite as his knowledge, smiled knowingly. "Ah, perfect choice. It suits your circumstances." I raised an eyebrow. "Circumstances?" He winked. "Life has a sense of humor, as you'll see. Sometimes it nudges us towards wisdom disguised as frivolity." I nodded, clutching the book to my chest like a talisman. Life, it seemed, was nothing if not theatrical. Every encounter, every misstep, every absurd coincidence was a reminder that even when the world is at its most ridiculous, there is value in paying attention, in laughing, and in participating fully, no matter how unpredictable the narrative. That evening, I found myself back home, unpacking groceries and placing Daniel's book next to the music box from the antique store. The juxtaposition struck me as comically appropriate, a physical manifestation of my life's dualities, chaos and order, laughter and grief, absurdity and clarity. Mr. Whiskers inspected both with the same critical gaze he reserved for my culinary experiments, and I imagined him silently offering approval. Dinner was quiet, a rare stillness that allowed my thoughts to drift freely. I reflected on the day's events, Harold flailing at the fountain, Margaret's unrelenting enthusiasm, and Daniel's fortuitous appearance. There was a pattern if you looked closely, a strange choreography in the chaos. Life seemed intent on reminding me that I could navigate the absurdity with a sense of humor and a measure of grace, or at least with the willingness to make mistakes spectacularly. Night descended with a soft inevitability. I curled up on the couch with Mr. Whiskers, the book in one hand, a glass of wine in the other, and the music box playing its delicate, bittersweet tune. Shadows stretched across the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost conspiratorial, as if they too were participants in the dark comedy of my life. I realized that the true plot twists aren't always violent or dramatic. They're subtle, quiet, and often absurdly funny. Sleep came slowly, teased by thoughts of Harold and Clarissa, by Margaret's relentless meddling, by Daniel's sudden appearance. Dreams were vivid, surreal, and layered with irony, a parade of absurdities that mirrored the real world with exaggerated fidelity. I watched myself navigating miniature versions of my own town, conversing with talking cats, narrowly avoiding tragedies, and laughing at the absurdity of every scene. When I woke, I felt a strange exhilaration, as if the day ahead might hold yet another unexpected twist, one that could amuse, challenge, or perhaps confound me, or perhaps all three at once. The lesson of the day was clear. Life will continue to throw absurdities in your path, some subtle, some outrageous. The only choice is how you respond. You can flinch, you can rail, you can lament, or you can laugh, participate, and find joy even in the smallest of victories. The unexpected conversation, the perfect cup of coffee, the quiet companionship of a cat who judges without malice. In embracing the absurd, you reclaim a measure of power over the chaos, turning heartbreak and disappointment into theater, comedy, and occasionally, a strange kind of beauty. And so, as I prepared for tomorrow, I felt a cautious optimism, a sense that the narrative was mine to shape, if I was willing to engage fully and humorously with the absurd, ironic, sometimes ridiculous gift that is life. The city, the park, the square, the bookstore, the gallery, all of it waited, oblivious, yet right.
The day began with a peculiar sense of inevitability, as though the universe had conspired overnight to ensure I could not ignore what was coming. Mr. Whiskers, perched on the windowsill, stretched lazily and regarded me with what I could only interpret as a judgmental version of anticipation. Coffee in hand, I surveyed the room, noting the scattered remnants of yesterday's explorations, books leaning precariously on shelves, a music box winding down its melancholic tune, and a pair of sunglasses Daniel had left behind after his impromptu visit to my house. Somehow, even in chaos, there was a rhythm, a peculiar harmony to it all. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the streets into a gentle haze, and I found myself wandering toward the old community center. It was hosting a craft fair, which I had avoided in the past, due to a mix of social anxiety and the sheer absurdity of homemade jams and scented candles. But today felt different. Today, I wanted to participate in the world, however absurdly, rather than merely observe it from the safety of my apartment. The center buzzed with activity. Children painted their hands in bright colors, elderly men argued over the quality of pottery, and a woman sold knitted scarves with patterns that suggested she had either a profound artistic vision or a deep-seated need to terrify knitters everywhere. Margaret appeared suddenly, as she always did, moving through the crowd like a self-appointed director of fate. "There you are," she exclaimed, grabbing my hand and spinning me toward a stall where a woman was demonstrating the art of candle making. "Life is short, darling. Sometimes you have to dip your fingers into the wax and see what burns, or what delights." I rolled my eyes, but smiled nonetheless. Margaret's energy was infectious in the most exhausting way, like a windstorm dressed in sequins. I followed her, curious, wary, and inexorably exhilarated, as she introduced me to artisans, storytellers, and a man who claimed to be professional juggler of both oranges and personal misfortune. Among the chaos, I noticed Daniel, his presence now seeming less coincidental and more like a carefully written subplot. He waved awkwardly, carrying a bag full of what appeared to be comic books, and I felt a pang of amusement. Our paths kept crossing, defying logic, and each encounter seemed to carry the weight of understated significance.
perhaps life was nudging me towards something, or perhaps it simply enjoyed the spectacle of coincidence. The morning stretched lazily into afternoon, a series of small adventures that felt absurdly cinematic. I tasted homemade honey, critiqued hand-painted ceramics, and narrowly avoided a disastrous encounter with a cat costume that had been intended for a child but looked terrifyingly realistic on the model. Through it all, Margaret's commentary provided both context and comic relief. Her observations, a running commentary on the human condition. Lunch was at a small cafe tucked into a side street, the kind that smelled of toasted bread and misplaced ambition. Daniel joined me, bringing with him the faint aroma of the city and a notebook full of sketches that were as chaotic as they were brilliant. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing confessions and laughter in equal measure, and I realized that there was a delicate intimacy in conversation that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with understanding the absurdity of existence. After lunch, the streets began to empty, leaving behind the faint hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts drifting between memory and observation. I thought of Harold, of Clarissa, and of all the tiny betrayals that had led me here. And yet, instead of resentment, I felt a peculiar sense of liberation. Life, I realized, was a series of plot twists, and my role was not merely to endure them, but to engage with them, to laugh, to falter, and to improvise in ways that honored both my pain and my humor. By late afternoon, I found myself on the steps of the town library, a place I had avoided for years due to a lingering sense of inadequacy and fear of people judging my choices. But today, I climbed the steps with deliberate purpose, determined to reclaim a fragment of my own narrative. Inside, the familiar scent of paper and polished wood greeted me, and I wandered among the shelves, discovering books I had once loved and forgotten. Each title felt like a bridge, connecting the person I had been to the person I was becoming. I settled into a quiet corner with a collection of essays on human resilience, losing myself in stories of people who had faced absurdity and betrayal and had emerged with humor intact. There was a peculiar kinship in reading about others' missteps, a comfort in knowing that imperfection is universal and that irony often accompanies survival. Mr. Whiskers, who had accompanied me, despite my protests, curled in my lap and purred, a gentle reminder that companionship comes in many forms, often silent and judicious. Evening approached, and with it came a quiet reflection. I returned home, unpacking a small bag of curiosities, books, sketches, and a candle that Margaret had insisted I light as a symbolic gesture. The act felt almost ceremonial, a recognition of the day's absurd triumphs and misadventures. I placed the candle on the windowsill and lit it, watching the flame flicker against the growing darkness outside. There is something profoundly ironic about celebrating small victories with fire, yet it felt entirely appropriate. Dinner was a solitary affair, composed of simple ingredients prepared with meticulous care. I spoke to Mr. Whiskers as I cooked, narrating each step as though I were both performer and audience. "Observe," I said, holding up a perfectly sliced carrot, "the triumphs of a life lived with cautious audacity." The cat responded with a slow blink, which I interpreted as approval, or perhaps quiet skepticism. Either way, it was enough. Later, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on and the town settle into its nocturnal rhythm. There was a peculiar beauty in the ordinary. A dog chasing its tail, a couple laughing on the corner, the distant sound of jazz drifting from someone's apartment. I thought of Daniel, of Margaret, of Harold, and of all the absurd tapestry of experiences that had brought me here. Life was messy, unpredictable, and occasionally cruel. Yet it was also dazzlingly humorous, capable of surprising even the most jaded observer. Sleep, when it finally arrived, was punctuated by dreams both surreal and revealing. I saw myself navigating miniature versions of my own town, conversing with anthropomorphic cats, narrowly avoiding minor catastrophes, and laughing at the absurdity of every scenario. There was Harold, Clarissa, Margaret, and Daniel, all performing roles that mirrored real life with exaggeration and irony. And through it all, I realized that the true meaning of survival is not in avoiding pain, but in engaging with it fully, finding humor, and recognizing beauty in the chaos. Morning arrived again, promising new possibilities, challenges, and absurdities. I awoke with a sense of cautious optimism, aware that life would continue to present plot twists, coincidences, and theatrical absurdities. Yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt ready, not to control, not to predict, but to participate, to embrace the narrative in all its messy, ironic, and unexpectedly delightful glory. Mr. Whiskers purred in agreement, a silent acknowledgement that despite everything, we were still capable of surviving, thriving, and laughing at the absurdity of it all. And so I prepared to step into another day, fully aware that the universe delights in irony, enjoys minor chaos, and occasionally rewards courage with moments of extraordinary, absurd beauty. The lesson, as always, is simple. Life is a dark comedy, and we are both audience and performer. The choice is ours, whether to sit passively and sigh, or to engage fully, laugh often, and relish the small victories that make existence tolerable, sometimes hilarious, and occasionally sublime.
The day began quietly, almost suspiciously so, as if the universe had paused to watch me, waiting to see how I would respond to its final act. Mr. Whiskers, now an expert in disinterested observation, perched on the arm of the sofa and flicked his tail with the precision of a metronome, as if timing my inevitable missteps. I brewed coffee strong enough to awaken the dead, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and settled by the window to watch the street slowly come alive. There was a peculiar beauty in this ordinary morning, the kind that comes only when you've survived enough absurdities to appreciate life's small, ironic gifts. I thought of the events that had led me here, of Harold's ridiculous flailing at the fountain, Clarissa's smug postcards, Margaret's relentless enthusiasm, and Daniel's improbable appearances. Each moment, each character, had been a thread in a tapestry I hadn't realized I was weaving. And as I sipped my coffee, I felt something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not the neat, cinematic closure of films or novels, but the messy, ironic, and oddly satisfying kind that life offers when you stop chasing it and start paying attention. By late morning, the world beckoned. I wandered through the familiar streets with a sense of purpose that was neither grandiose nor desperate. It was simply alive. The town had a rhythm I had come to appreciate, an understated choreography of small dramas, minor victories, and absurd encounters. I passed the cafe, noting the barista's precise movements, the steady hum of espresso machines, and the laughter of patrons who had no idea how dramatically their minor joys affected an observer like me. Daniel appeared, once again as if conjured by fate or a particularly mischievous narrative force. He carried a small package and a sketch pad under his arm, looking both delighted and slightly bewildered by the day. Our smiles met, a silent acknowledgement that the absurdities of the past weeks had forged a connection neither of us could entirely explain. He said, "I figured I'd find you here. Life seems to have a sense of humor about our schedules." I laughed, stirring my coffee. Or it's conspiring to teach us patience through coincidence. We wandered together, exploring shops, parks, and quiet streets, exchanging observations about life's minor catastrophes and occasional brilliance. There was a subtle intimacy in these moments, a recognition that connection doesn't always require grand gestures or declarations. Sometimes it is simply found in shared amusement at the absurdity of existence.
As the afternoon unfolded, I found myself at the edge of the town's old pier, the lake stretching out in calm, reflective beauty. The water shimmered with sunlight, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of pine and earth. Daniel and I walked slowly, our conversation meandering from trivialities to confessions that were neither dramatic nor burdensome, but profoundly human. I realized that the act of sharing stories, of vulnerability and humor, creates a bridge stronger than any planned intervention or carefully constructed facade. Suddenly, Harold appeared, not flailing, not attempting to charm a dog or a stranger, but quietly standing at the edge of the pier, looking at the water. Clarissa was still absent, a detail I noted without judgment or surprise. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate. I observed him as one might watch a minor character step into a climactic scene. Familiar, yet unfamiliar. Flawed, yet human. Ridiculous, yet unexpectedly poignant. He noticed me, hesitated, then nodded, a gesture both tentative and conciliatory. I returned the nod, aware that whatever past grievances lingered between us had no immediate resolution, but also recognizing that they no longer held the power to define my present. Life, I realized, is less about forgiveness than it is about perspective. You can hold grudges, or you can laugh at them, and the latter often feels far more satisfying. Margaret appeared as well, as if she were the narrative glue holding the chaotic threads together. She clutched a thermos of something vaguely medicinal and proclaimed, "Ah, the final act! Isn't it splendid when all the characters finally show up?" Her expression suggested she had orchestrated nothing, yet she thrived in the perception of control. I smiled, acknowledging that Margaret's role in my story had always been to remind me that life's absurdities are best met with enthusiasm and irreverence. The sun began its slow descent, casting golden light across the lake, the town, and our small gathering of humans and one judgmental cat. Conversations meandered, laughter punctuated the quiet, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt exquisitely balanced between chaos and serenity. Daniel sketched the scene with the careful precision of an observer who understands that the ordinary can be extraordinary if captured with attention and care. Later, I returned home, carrying with me the small treasures of the day, a sketch, a memory, and the faint, lingering scent of lake water and pine. Mr. Whiskers greeted me with a slow blink of approval, settling onto my lap as if to say that after all the absurdities and plot twists, we had survived with dignity and tact. Dinner was modest, the kind of meal that sustains both body and reflection. Roasted vegetables, a piece of bread, and a quiet contentment that tasted almost foreign after months of emotional turbulence. Evening stretched into night, and I lit a candle on the windowsill, its flame dancing in tandem with the faint reflections of the streetlights outside. The music box from the antique store played softly in the background, its delicate tune weaving through the room like a whisper of the past, mingling with the present. I thought of Harold, Clarissa, Margaret, Daniel, and all the absurd, ironic, and occasionally ridiculous events that had led me to this evening. There was no perfect resolution, no neatly tied bow, but there was understanding, acceptance, and the peculiar delight that comes from observing life without being entirely victimized by it. Sleep, when it arrived, carried with it dreams that were at once absurd and comforting. I saw myself navigating the miniature version of the town, conversing with anthropomorphic cats, performing minor heroics, and laughing at every ridiculous twist of circumstance. Harold appeared too, not as a villain or a tragedy, but as a flawed human presence in a world that demanded improvisation and humor. Daniel offered guidance in these dreams, though in a quiet, unassuming way, reminding me that connection is both fragile and resilient, and often arrives when least expected. Morning came with a gentle insistence. I awoke with Mr. Whiskers curled against my side, the remnants of dreams fading into the early light. The day promised new possibilities, challenges, and surprises, but I felt a profound sense of readiness, an understanding that life is less about control and more about engagement. The absurdities, betrayals, coincidences, and unexpected joys would continue, as they always do, and I was prepared to meet them with humor, curiosity, and courage. I made coffee, strong and bitter, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen and settling into my chest like a warm, ironic embrace. The streets beyond my window were already alive with movement, children laughing, dogs barking, and the quiet murmur of people living lives both ordinary and extraordinary. I thought of Daniel, of Margaret, of Harold and Clarissa, and all the incountable small absurdities that had brought me to this moment. Life, in all its messy, ironic glory, was waiting, and I was eager to participate. The lesson of the narrative, now fully visible from my vantage point, was clear. Existence is a dark comedy, filled with plot twists, coincidences, and characters who defy prediction. We are simultaneously audience, protagonist, and supporting cast, navigating absurdity, heartbreak, and joy with whatever grace and humor we can muster. To survive, and perhaps even thrive, we must engage, laugh, and embrace the uncertainty that defines our lives. As I stepped outside, Mr. Whiskers leading the way like a silent furry herald, I felt the exhilarating freedom of a story still unfolding. The town, the streets, the people, and the improbable events of life stretched before me like an unwritten script, and I, finally, was ready to write my part with honesty, irony, and courage. Aware that the best stories are messy, unpredictable, and vividly alive. Life, after all, is absurd, and it is beautiful.